This podcast contains potentially sensitive topics and strong language. Listener discretion is advised.
So growing up, my dad was a builder and a developer. You know, he developed large portion of the community I grew up in. And so I always kind of had an interest in development. Yeah, and part of it was, my dad was like, if I'm going to help you go to school, you're going to get a degree that's going to propel you into being being able to take care of yourself. And so I just was like, business school. It's kind of an overarching thing, right? You can do anything with a business degree. Somehow I started following Facing Homelessness on Facebook. One day there was a post about a guy named Peter, and I realized that Peter was the guy that I saw panhandling at my exit all the time. So one day I rolled down my window and I was like, hey, I saw you on Facing Homelessness.
I'm Rex Holbein, and welcome to You Know Me Now, a podcast conversation that strives to amplify the unheard voices in our community. In these episodes, I want to remind all of our listeners that the folks who share here do so with a great deal of vulnerability and courage. They share a common hope that by giving all of us a window into their world, they're opening an increased level of awareness, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, a connection within our own community. We all have our own unique paths in life. It's a journey of discovery, of, when it comes right down to it, of learning about ourselves. And in the process, we are constantly reviewing the path we've already traveled and wondering, and often worrying, about the path in front of us. Through it all, we do our best to plan a course of action. We craft a direction that includes our hopes and dreams. But it doesn't always go per plan. Life has a way of throwing curveballs. You can find yourself suddenly taking an unplanned off-ramp, journeying down side paths that you had no idea even existed. That's what happened to Blair, a young woman who was on her path as a student at the University of Washington.
Yeah, so I grew up in Kirkland on the east side of Seattle. I lived there my whole life until I moved to the city when I was 25, 26. Yeah, I mean, my first memories are good, family trips. We had a boat growing up. I lived a very, privileged life.
What were you excited about growing up? Give me some of the typical Blair dreams and things that you were into.
Well, I played a lot of sports growing up, like every type of sport, soccer, basketball, and I was in aquatics, so I was a diver and a swimmer growing up. So, younger, thought I was going to be in the WNBA, and then that kind of faded. I worked in aquatics all growing up, so I was a junior lifeguard from the time I was 12 until I was 15, and then I worked for the city of Kirkland and the city of Bellevue until I graduated college when I was 27.
And you grew up probably from day one thinking you were going to college? Was that always part of the plan?
It wasn't really part of the plan. I hated school, actually, from pretty much from the get. I also suffered from anxiety from when I was born. I had really bad separation anxiety from my parents, so I didn't like going to school. I left halfway through my junior year. I also think that revolved around growing up when the opioid crisis started. I have a lot of friends that have passed away due to overdose that I grew up with. Like my, high school boyfriend at the time was, using opiates, and a lot of my friends were using opiates, and I luckily didn't ever get sucked into that. But I think just kind of shit hitting the fan the beginning of my junior year. So I left.
Can you explain why you didn't, if all your friends, including your boyfriend, not all your friends, but a lot of your friends and your boyfriend especially were using opiates, why not you?
I think I just saw what addiction did to people, and I didn't want to go down that path. I also, my drug use primarily with cannabis was pretty sporadic at that point. I wasn't drinking a lot. I wasn't smoking a lot. Also, the opiate use was pretty hidden, I would say, at that point. It wasn't like an open thing, like you would maybe say now with the fentanyl crisis. So, you know, as well as doing opiates, people were doing a lot of ecstasy, drinking a lot, smoking a lot of weed. I hung out with the skateboarding community, and that just happened to be like a thing in our friend group. And I think I just didn't want to go down that path.
Over the last several decades, Seattle residents have become increasingly overwhelmed by the issue of homelessness. Just to the east, across Lake Washington, the cities of Bellevue, Kirkland, and Redmond have seen far fewer visible symptoms of homelessness, although the issue is still there. I wondered how aware Blair was of homelessness while she was growing up in the Kirkland area.
So we did have our token, like, few homeless people in Kirkland. Growing up, my mom worked for the Kirkland Downtown Association when I was in elementary school. And so there was a few people that she knew pretty well. We had a few panhandlers, in Kirkland. I was aware that homelessness existed, but it was on a very, very small scale, and there was no actual understanding of how that came to be or why people were living that way. We just had our few people in Kirkland that kind of kept to themselves, really just, stayed out of trouble and, were known to the community, but
it really didn't rise to, like, the consciousness of people living on the east side to talk about it, or it wasn't...
No, I would say the homelessness conversation has entered the chat on the east side in the last 5 to 10 years.
As a youngster, Blair worked as a lifeguard in Kirkland and Bellevue. She was interested in recreational therapy and was heading towards that field. At 17, she started working at the Bellevue Aquatic Center, where they had a therapy pool. She learned to work with folks with special needs and disabilities and found it interesting work.
I was known as, like, the teacher that specialized in working with kids with special needs. If we had kids with special needs enrolled in our city programs, like, I was the one teaching them some lessons. Like, I always really enjoyed that part of my job. My path has always been of being of service in some way.
Yeah. Where do you think that comes from?
I don't know. I think a part of it is, like, wanting to fix people, which is not a healthy thing. And then I think, I just enjoy helping people. I think it's a part of who I am.
Blair's father was a developer on the east side, running what was primarily a family business. Despite her interest in aquatics and potentially going into recreational therapy as a career, she felt the pull towards real estate development and decided to pursue a business degree.
So growing up, my dad was a builder and a developer. He developed large portion of the community I grew up in, anywhere from single family homes to, like, condo developments. But I always looked at my dad as a really conscientious developer. He would make plans around just saving, like, trees. So there'd be an old growth tree on a property, and he would, plan where the houses were going to go just to save that tree.
Nice.
And so I think, I was just around building my whole life. Like, we grew up next to my dad would build a house, we'd move into it, he'd be building the property down the street, right? So I grew up on job sites. A large portion of our family worked for my dad growing up. My mom, my cousins, my uncle, that's just how it was. Like, they'd come over in the morning and, like, it was a very family-oriented business. And so I always, like, kind of had an interest in development, but it wasn't until I went back to school when I was 22 and decided I wasn't probably going to go to school for what I thought I was going to go to school for. I think I just had fallen out of aquatics a little bit. I started dating my partner my second year back into school when I was 23. We met when I was 22, almost 23. And I started coming to the city a lot more. So I was over here way more. At that time, I was living in Redmond. And I just was like, I don't really think that's what I want to go to school for. And so it shifted from that to thinking I wanted to go to business school. Yeah, and part of it was, my dad was like, if I'm going to help you go to school, you're going to get a degree that's going to propel you into being being able to take care of yourself.
So did you have a good conversation with your father about, hey, I think I'm going to go into business and do development?
I mean, yeah, it was, like, I think an ongoing conversation. My partner is also an entrepreneur, and so I think that I found, like, what he was doing interesting. And so I just was like, business school, it's kind of an overarching thing, right? You can do anything with a business degree.
While pursuing her business degree at the University of Washington, and visiting her partner living in Seattle, Blair began to notice those living outside without basic needs being met.
I think I understood that affordable housing was becoming less of a thing in Seattle. And so I was like, yeah, we need, more affordable housing. And so I was kind of geared towards, like low income, affordable housing. And then, some things started to shift within me. I'd say like my junior, senior year, I worked at I had an internship at Attain Housing in Kirkland, which is a transitional housing agency for families. So I was like on the track, but there was definitely some shifts occurring.
When coming into Seattle from the east side via the 520 bridge, Blair would take the Montlake exit.
Yeah, I started coming to, see my partner more regularly in the city, and I would take the Montlake exit. And under the Ballard Bridge at that time, there was a pretty large encampment. And so I just started noticing, our unhoused community more than I had.
At about the same time, Blair started to follow the Facing Homelessness Facebook page, where I was posting stories of people living outside.
Somehow I started following Facing Homelessness on Facebook. I don't know how I started following it. I don't remember. One day there was a post about a guy named Peter, and I realized that Peter was the guy that I saw panhandling at my exit all the time. So one day I rolled down my window and I was like, hey, I saw you on Facing Homelessness. And that's what started my journey, is my friendship with Peter.
Blair wasn't aware of it at the time, but by opening herself to one person struggling through homelessness, she had just made a shift in her life path. It would have profound implications.
And probably that shift you weren't aware of yet.
No, it was extremely gradual. I had no idea. I wouldn't even have probably at that point been like, oh, Peter's my friend. He was just the guy that I gave money to at my exit or gave food to. And then I started asking, like, what he needed, like, because I think most of his posts on Facebook were about getting him books.
Yep.
Because he always had a book in his hand. Was bringing him sleeping bags and stuff. I would just, like, post on my own Facebook, like, does anybody have anything? I'm going to go,
Let me ask you this question before you go on. So the first roll down the window and hello, right? But at some point, you probably parked your car because you can't, when the light's only going for so long. So you must have gotten out of your car.
Yeah.
Tell us how that happened.
So it eventually went from, so Peter was usually at the eastbound exit at Montlake. So I would get off and I'd see him and I'd try and make the red light so I could give him some money or some food.
By the way, isn't that funny? Most people try to make the green light.
Yeah.
And you're trying to make the red light.
Yeah. Yeah, I would try and stop at the light. But yeah, you don't hit the light every time, right? So eventually, it was parking my car or checking in with him, seeing if he needed anything. Montlake Market was open at the time. And so, started getting out of my car and talking to Peter. I think luckily for me, Peter was an easy transition into working with our unhoused community because Peter was a gem. He was so soft-spoken, so nice. He wasn't intimidating in any way.
I think what you're saying is important, that we all need an easy entry point into this conversation on homelessness, right? Because in general, homelessness is intimidating and overwhelming.
Yes, I agree. I think without Peter, I don't know if I ever would have become friends with James. It kind of happened, I guess, organically. James was a fixture on the Facing Homelessness page too, but my true friendship was with Peter, but sometimes when Peter wasn't there, I would give the stuff to James instead.
Yeah, because Peter and James shared the same spot.
Yeah.
They would actually, that was coordinated.
Yep. Montlake didn't have a large, homeless community. We kind of had our tokens, and Peter and James were two of them. And so, it just kind of, I think I remember pretty specifically, I had a sleeping bag for Peter. He wasn't out. It was cold. I didn't want the sleeping bag to go to waste. And so I gave it to James instead. And that kind of started my also helping of James.
And share a little bit about your feelings during that time, because you're in business school, you're on a path, and you're stepping out of a very kind of, especially stepping out of, a white woman, growing up on the East Side. But by and large, that first rolling the window down and reaching out to Peter was a little bit of a leap, right?
Yeah, I think I've always been, so I think, working with our unhoused community at the Bellevue Aquatic Center helped, but then, talking to someone that comes to your front desk is very different than rolling down your window and chatting with someone and trying to build a friendship. But I do think, it started from food and money and items to truly having a friendship with Peter. I would stop and check in on him, ask what he needed. Peter really wanted a job. I ended up just posting on a neighborly group in Kirkland, and Peter actually ended up getting a job on the East Side at Safeway. So once Peter got that job, that's when I started interacting more heavily with Facing Homelessness, because Peter needed clothes for that job. And so I reached out to Facing Homelessness, and you guys did an ask to get him, set up for work. And he tried, what's so frustrating is, he tried his absolute hardest to make that job work. He really wanted to be a productive member of society again, which I hate that term, but yeah, it's a term we have. He didn't want to be outside. He wanted to reconnect with his family. He didn't like the situation he was in. And, his downfall into homelessness, I think, is more classic than people he lived in his car. He was still working. His car got towed. Boom. On the streets, right? Because he had no way to get his car out of impound. And I think that is way more prevalent of a story than people think it is. And obviously a very different story than our friend James. But yeah, Peter was definitely my segue into things. And that's when my direction at school kind of took a turn. I actually shared your TED Talk. We had to bring TED Talks in once. And I brought my TED Talk that I brought was your TED Talk. And I got a lot of pushback for my opinions within the business community. I actually had one other student ask me why I was in business school if I just wanted to work, if I just wanted to open a nonprofit, which in case you didn't know, nonprofits are businesses. But I got a lot of pushback for my opinions, and I got in some pretty heated arguments around how I felt.
Peter's job did not last long. And it was a learning opportunity for Blair to dive deeper, to better understand how complicated homelessness is.
Unfortunately, due to what was going on with Peter at the time, which we would, come down the line to learn was, an addiction. He had substance abuse disorder, that it was really hard for him to hold a job. Now, take substance abuse disorder out of it, he wouldn't have been able to hold the job anyway. You don't have a place to shower. You don't have a place to charge your phone to wake up on time. There's so many barriers that people that are unhoused experience to employment.
Yeah. And I'm going to jump in and say, I think you were just entering into the whole realm of being in service, and that was blind to you at that point, right? Now where you're at, you understand a little more about all those barriers. And the reason I want to share that is I think the process of people living in homes, being in service to those that are unhoused, it's such a journey of learning really what and how to navigate the process.
Yeah, and I would say even with my personal experience around friends with addiction, I didn't even know Peter was, at that time, I had no idea Peter had substance abuse disorder. He definitely had signs of it. He had abscesses. He would tell me they were spider bites. I took it at face value, right? Yeah. So looking back, I'm oh my God, how, duh, what was I thinking? But yeah, I think it was a gradual transition. I would say it took it was about a year or two.
As Blair was focusing on her schooling, she was also getting more involved with the homeless community. She started to attend the community cleanups that Facing Homelessness was organizing. She started to make connections with other folks living outside, such as James and Michael, both panhandling at the Montlake off-ramp.
Really what I think the biggest transition was about a month before I graduated from getting my bachelor's in business, you posted about James needing someone to help him navigate the system. And I already had a friendship with James, and James, he was a hard person to interact with on occasion. You would drive through the Montlake exit, he'd be flailing, he'd be bleeding from picking his skin. Like, he just had these episodes that I don't think we even know now necessarily what induced them. And so I said, I don't feel like James should have to get to know another person. I'll do it.
While Blair would probably not describe this moment in her journey as heroic or even courageous, it was tremendously so. As a young woman in her 20s, a month from graduating, she decides to take on the monumental task of helping James find housing, something he had been unable to do for 40 years. I asked Blair to tell us how she saw James as a person and why she thought they developed such a deep friendship.
James was just a little white dude from Texas. But James has a different story. He was homeless for 40 years before I helped get him housing, and, severely addicted, and it was pretty apparent, right? Illiterate, so would beg with his hands, didn't fly a sign, which is not, historically is never really a thing in Seattle. Had lived at the Montlake exit for about 25 years at the point where I entered his life. And I don't know, I look back and I'm like, whoa, what? Why did we connect the way we did? But James and I built my most strong and beautiful friendship. And he drastically changed my life. And I miss him so much. It'll be next month. He'll be gone for 2 years. And those 2 years that I got to have a really solid friendship with him drastically changed my life.
I want to just one quick thing before you launch into this. The other thing that I want to share, and I've heard this from many people about James, is most people that saw James, they were afraid of him.
Yes.
I mean, he, as you had mentioned earlier, he was he was disheveled, and his clothes were always dirty and torn, and his hair and his beard, everything was just a mess, and he had scabs. But on top of that, often he would do fairly erratic, kind of almost violent arm wavings and movements, and you really just, and you could see him sprawled out on the sidewalk with legs out into the road, and he was a hot mess, honestly, almost, I would say 80% of the time.
Yeah, so I would definitely agree with all of that. I would say he was probably one of the most, frequent unhoused flyers at the Montlake UW Montlake Hospital, very well known there. Yeah, and
very well taken care of there too. Which
yes, they were
a shout out to the UW medical team in the ER there because they took care of him. Yeah,
and he was a hard case. There'd be days I couldn't interact with him. For example, the Montlake Market, he wasn't allowed to go in there. He literally was banned from the Montlake Market. But yeah, incontinent. Was only bathed when he would be taken to the hospital, only probably had lice. He
lived under the ramp,
literally
in the dirt under the ramp.
Wouldn't live in a tent. He would if we brought it to him, but it would quickly be disheveled and not livable. Literally lived under the off ramp of the westbound Montlake exit, and had for a very, very, very long time.
When Blair graduates from the University of Washington with her business degree, she does something unexpected and remarkable.
So at this point, I had moved to Seattle. I was living with my partner in Ballard. And I took on James's advocacy right before I graduated. And when I graduated, I just started applying to nonprofits that serve the unhoused community. So I cold call Reach one day, which is, a great nonprofit in Seattle that serves our unhoused community. And I was like, hey, I'm an advocate for this guy. I need to know where he's enrolled in services. I think I was just so compassionate about my work with him that the person I talked to was like, well, I'm going to tell you where he's enrolled. I don't know who it was. I don't think they were necessarily supposed to do what they were doing, but they told me where he was tiered in Seattle, because there's a system where you can look up where people have enrollment, the HMIS system in Seattle. or in King County. And so he was enrolled with, at that time, the LINK program. It doesn't exist anymore. And with the host program at DESC.
He was. God, I wonder who got him into that.
Through his arrests. So it was due to his interactions with SPD and the King County sheriffs. So, I mean, he was well known in the community, right? But he was also well known as someone that was kind of like you couldn't give services to. So...
Well, when he saw, and you and I both witnessed this a number of times, but when he saw a policeman in uniform, right, approaching, his biorisms would just go through the roof, and he would instantly become difficult. So he really had been traumatized. And I'm not even saying that the police had done anything wrong when I say that. I'm just saying that interaction always raised his level of engagement in a negative way.
Yeah, and I think there was even one time during that summer where I called you later at night, and I was like, I just drove by, he's in the street flailing. What do I do? Like, I don't know what to do, because I knew what he was doing was unsafe, but I didn't want to call, like, 911, and you were like, don't. Like, just don't. He'll figure it out. Like, he'll calm down, he'll get out of the street. Like, don't. He hates being put in an ambulance. He hates interacting with the police. Like,
it just makes it worse.
When you were like, he's lived his life like this for a very long time. Like, you know, what's your intervention going to do right now, right? Is it just going to be more traumatizing for him? And so I didn't. And then I went 2 days later and he was totally fine. You know, we never figured out what caused these episodes for James, but he would come in and out of them, right? They wouldn't last forever. He normally wouldn't remember them. We still don't know if they were mentally health-induced, if they were drug-induced. Like, we have no idea, because once he actually started receiving services, they de-escalated. So I found out he was enrolled in host, and I found out who his case manager was. So I cold call this girl named Savannah on host, and I'm like, hey, I'm James Dobbs' advocate. I need you to actually do stuff for him, because I can't... as not being case, like, I need you to get him housing. Like, this guy wants to go inside. So she came out and met me one day at Montlake, and I introduced, you know, her as his case manager, and she was like, so you just, like, do this, like, on a volunteer basis? And I was like, yeah, like, I just come out and hang out with James. And she was like, my program's hiring. And so I applied to work at host at DESC. Little did I know, James was not like a lot of host clients. I was like, oh, I work with James Dobbs. I can work with anyone. Well, that was a misconception in my mind, because working on host was probably one of the most difficult and rewarding years of my life.
And explain what you mean by not typical. Like, what's the difference?
I mean, host serves the most severely mentally ill people in King County. And they're people that cannot access conventional mental health services. So you are outreaching them to give them their medications. You're a payee. You know, a lot of my clients
Meaning those folks have money, and it's being regulated out at a certain stream so they don't blow it all.
Correct.
In the first 4 days.
So pay services is one of the services. So they're on usually, you know, Social Security, disability. That is being awarded to DESC. And then there is a plan through their payee on how they're allotted their money to make sure that they, like, you know, if you have an EBT card, like, what are you going to do? You're probably going to lose it, right? So, or someone's going to steal your money. Like, there's just tons of reasons why payees exist. You know, some of my clients I couldn't hold a conversation with. Word salad all the time. Some were super erratic. I mean, I had a whole scope of care there, but, you know, clients in and out of mental health hospitals, clients in and out of jail, but everything, you know, was a scope from, like, kind of where James was at to, like, literally clients you couldn't have a conversation with.
Yeah.
Or all in between.
So you thought, I can be in service to James, and if I can handle that, I can handle anything. And then you find out that actually James is on the more functional end of the spectrum. And it gets either, however you want to say it, worse or more intense as you went into the job.
Yeah. And, you know, kind of the joke was at the time in homeless services is, if you can make it on host a year, anyone will hire you. And so...
You've gone through the ringer.
Yeah, you've gone through the ringer. And so it was interesting, my position on host, because I was James's advocate, but I worked for the program he was enrolled in. And so people would be like, we don't understand this dynamic. And I'm like, well, I was literally hired on host because of my relationship with James.
Yeah, the title just morphed.
And I wasn't his case manager. I was his advocate. He had a case manager. But I was always speaking in, like, meetings about him.
I could see why that was confusing.
Yeah, like, there was a social worker at UW that was like, this doesn't make sense, and, like, called the supervisors at host and was like, why is there two women talking to me? How does this girl know all about this, but, like, she's not.
Were they concerned about privacy issues or something? Or like,
I think it was, kind of some HIPAA stuff. Like, I don't.
Yeah, whatever.
We thought it was an overstep, but whatever. And so within about 6 months of working there, James was housed. Yeah. It was, well, and that was the goal of taking on his advocacy, right? Was to get him housing. And the reason James got housed is because he was on the brink of death. Like, he was going to die outside. He had been in and out of the hospital quite a few times. And you and I had an interaction with the SPD one day because he had been discharged from the hospital. He should have been put in a skilled nursing facility.
Discharged, left with his hospital gown on.
Yeah. To the streets. Like, you gave him a tent. We were checking on him every day. Like, he stole a wheelchair as a walker from the hospital as he was leaving. And I think this is where the housed community doesn't understand the barriers that unhoused people face. So James should have been put in a skilled nursing facility for rehab, as most people would be after a hospital discharge. And due to James's behavioral health issues and his substance abuse disorder, he was not a candidate for skilled nursing. So he was discharged to the street because he wanted to be out of the hospital, which was understandable. He'd been there, I think, this time was like a 3-week stint. But at this point, he was on Suboxone. He was on medicated assisted treatment for his opioid disorder. And he was doing, he was actually doing much better, but his health was failing, right? So there was one Saturday morning I went to check on him. So this is kind of where, like, being an employee on host and being his advocate was a weird space because I would check on him on the weekends. James and I would tell each other we loved each other. Like, these were things you don't conventionally do as a case manager. And so I called you one morning and I was like, dude, like, you know, he was completely soiled, was freezing because he was soiled in urine. And so I literally waved down SPD, which is something I never would have done, right? But I knew he needed to go to the Crisis Solutions Center through DESC with the mobile crisis team. And so the only people that in Seattle that can dispatch mobile crisis are fire and police. And so I waved down SPD, and this officer was telling us, you know, he's like, I've seen him like this 100 times. And we were like, we know you have, but this is different. Yeah. Like, today is different. Yeah. He needs to go.
He's close to dying.
He's going to die. He needs to go inside. And so we eventually convinced the officer to call mobile crisis. They came out and they did take him, and they put a grave disability affidavit in to have him detained, to you know, put him in the hospital because he wasn't going willingly. Like, he got to the CSC and he was in such poor shape, he couldn't even get his clothes off to bathe.
Yeah.
So he was out of their scope of care, basically. He ended up AMAing, so against medical advice, leaving the CSC. And I want to say it was maybe 2 weeks later we got him into housing. But he was in, it was touch and go there for those 2 weeks.
Yeah.
There was they're called safe haven units. So they're people that have no documentation. So because James had been homeless since he was 15, no ID, couldn't get him an ID because he didn't go to high school. Like, you just couldn't get him his documents that he needed. We did have a birth certificate, which Facing Homelessness had acquired through some other ladies' help a few years prior. And
you found his family.
And we had a next of kin document. So I just asked my dad to, look into the names that were on the next of kin. And my dad found his sister in Tyler, Texas. So I sent a letter to an address in hopes that maybe we would reconnect with his family. He hadn't spoken to his family in about 25 years. And I got a call from a woman crying a week later. So his sister Becky, called me and was like, he's alive. Like, you know, they all just thought he was dead. So I went down to Montlake and we called Becky for the first time. And he talked to Becky once a week till the week he passed away.
He was a spunky guy at 50, you know, 5 when he died, or 54?
54, yeah.
Yeah. He had a twinkle in his eye. There's no doubt, right? Like, he was a charmer. When he was in his good space, he was funny and he was a charmer.
Yeah, I think like our relationship made some people uncomfortable because like me and James genuinely loved each other. He, you know, genuinely like one of the people I cared about most in my life. And I think one of my other favorite stories is he was a deadhead. He followed the Grateful Dead up and down the West Coast, like, and when he was in the hospital passing away, his hospice nurses had told his day nurse that he was a deadhead, and she left her phone on his pillow playing Grateful Dead the last couple of days that he was alive. And we all wore Grateful Dead shirts to his memorial. And seeing him come out of that really, really deep substance use. By the time he was housed, he was on Suboxone. He wasn't using street opiates anymore. And it was really beautiful to see him. I mean, someone that had been addicted for almost their entire life come out of that due to harm reduction, you know, was really, really cool.
You know, one of the things that I remember you sharing with me, and I've seen the opposite so many times, is that when people that have been chronically homeless move inside, that transition is extremely difficult. Like, people will get a room and still stay at the park, or get a room but sleep on the floor, or they have to leave all the windows open, or they're just these really quirky things that are counterintuitive. You would think, oh my God, you've got a bed for the first time in 25 years and you're not sleeping in it, right? But that that change is really difficult. Describe James's process.
I mean, almost seamless, right? Like, we were all really worried about it. We were really worried he was going to go to Montlake all the time and, like, he wasn't going to stay inside. James never stayed outside a day again after he had his housing. We got his apartment furnished by donations. He's really wanted a TV. I took him grocery shopping a couple times, and he, like, loved to make fajitas. I have a picture of him, like, buying cilantro on my phone, which was, like, just cracked me up. But yeah, like, you know, had his little princess in the pea bed because he had gotten multiple mattresses donated, and he, like, just stacked them up on his little twin bed frame, and he had, like, a, you know, nice couch. And I was also really worried his apartment would be really dirty. And it was one of the cleanest apartments I would go in. Yeah. You know, his incontinence was a really, really big issue when he lived outside. I used to try and address it with him when he lived outside, and he would just be like, I'm an old man, Blair, leave me alone. And I'd be like, okay. Never incontinent again after he moved inside. We later figured out it was like a defense mechanism, so people would leave him alone. Because James had historically been beat up quite a few times when he lived outside. So, yeah, we figured out, like, it was just a defense mechanism. I made him promise me when he moved inside he would bathe.
Yeah.
And he kept that promise.
I think I saw him. I think you called me up and I came down to visit maybe the second or third day after he moved in, and he had shaved and showered. And I took a picture of him against the back wall out in the alley there. And he was just radiating. He was so beautiful.
But yeah, like, I think it was the second or third day he moved in, and I went to check on him, and he's like, Blair, I need clippers. And he made me shave his head and shave his beard and got all cleaned up. I mean, you would think for someone that had been outside for 40 years that he never would have lived the way he did inside.
Yeah, he didn't waste a moment of it.
No, he, you know, and he was there for like almost 18 months.
So tell me those last days for James.
So what initially led to James's decline health-wise is he had a stroke in November of 2021. And so he had a stroke. He was found in his apartment, like, unconscious. And I got a call, you know, he was at Montlake. He was there for 2 2 months.
And when you say Montlake, you mean the hospital?
Yeah, so he was always taken to UW-Montlake because that's where he'd been a frequent flyer. So he was taken there, and the stroke had paralyzed half of his body. And so that kind of started a decline, that stroke. So he was put on hospice. He got a caregiver. His caregiver was a saint. So he had, 5 days of care a week. And he lived at home for another 6 months, just smoking cigarettes and joints, bedridden. Kept talking about how he was going to get a motorized wheelchair, and we were all terrified that he was going to convince someone that was a good idea, because we were like, he cannot be out on the streets like this. And then, I got a call, that he was unconscious, and that, there wasn't he couldn't be on home hospice anymore. He needed to go to the hospital. And then he was at UW-Montlake for probably 4 days to a week.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe a week.
But unconscious. You and I were there, actually, the last time he had like a more lucid episode. He was trying to climb out of bed and was talking to us, and then 2 days later he passed away.
Yeah.
But I'm just, it was obviously extremely difficult to lose him, but the care that he received the last 2 years of his life were so beautiful. And after he had passed away, like, at a doctor that had worked at UW-Montlake with him, like, flew out from Philadelphia, showed up at Kerner Scott, like, found out from Dennis about the funeral and came to the funeral and spoke. Like, he, for as rough and tumble as a man he was, he touched a lot of people, and it was really cool to see the community that had helped him, like, over the years come together. And then, we had a funeral, and then last year we spread his ashes.
A couple things that I want to just remark on. One is, again, I'm just so amazed by the journey that you went through as a young woman. Pretty brave, pretty beautiful, and amazing, right? And I hope that the way this is being captured, people can feel that. Like, and I want to say, and I believe this so much, that that's available for everyone, and I think the difference is that you just acted on it. You just lowered the window and began, right? And I think that's how it's enriched your life, for your interest to help Peter, and eventually James, ended up helping you even more. And that's the special sauce of it all that I wish everyone knew, right? Yeah,
it changed my life in such a drastic, beautiful way. So I went and worked for, host at DESC for a year, and that was like an amazingly life-changing experience. And then I went and worked for the lead program at Reach for another 18 months. And, I still have relationships with, people I met while working with people that are unhoused, and those relationships are really, really, really important to me. But it changed who I was, right? And I think we haven't touched on it, but James and I shared a love for cannabis. I think it's one of the reasons we got along so well. But 9 months after James passed away, I decided to get sober. And I've been sober for about 14 and a half months. And so I think my relation, I'm a diehard harm reductionist. I believe in harm reduction wholeheartedly, but being sober has also changed my perspective. I don't believe that abstinence works for everyone. It definitely didn't work for James. But
I'm going to interrupt you and just say, can you explain for those that don't understand what harm reduction is in your definitional view of that term?
So harm reduction for me is helping people meet their goals without addressing necessarily their substance use disorder. So if that's giving, for James, it was, when he was living outside, he needed clean needles and Narcan. And, when or giving people pipes to use, or, just like those types of things. Also, meeting their medical needs without addressing their substance use. Harm reduction in Seattle is a hot topic right now. A lot of people don't believe in it. They look at it as enabling. I wholeheartedly disagree with that. It's keeping people in a place where they're using in a safer manner until they make different choices, if they choose to make different choices.
And the underlying belief is that when people are getting their needs met, and I mean needs met in general, then they're in a much better place to address some of the harmful things that they're doing to themselves.
Yes, and I will also say, from working with our unhoused community in the way that I have, if I lived outside, I would be in active addiction. And I would not just be in active addiction with cannabis. I would be in active addiction with harder drugs. The trauma that you endure as living someone unhoused is something that, unless you've lived unhoused, you will never understand. The secondary trauma that I endured by being in homeless services was something that contributed greatly to my use skyrocketing when I was in homeless services, and why I had to take a step back to get sober. We've talked about it a little bit before. People that think that people live outside as a choice is such a misconception of our unhoused community. It's sad.
It's a case of being uninformed.
Yeah, no one chooses to live outside. And like I said earlier, even if you're severely mentally ill and can't live inside, that's not a choice. That's due to trauma and mental illness. And so, I have a different viewpoint on, now that I'm sober myself and I work a Buddhist recovery program, my mindset has changed on a lot of things. And I reflect on my time as a case manager and wonder if I could have done things with better boundaries and more compassion. But it's definitely changed my perspective. And it's hard to hold being a diehard harm reductionist and also working an abstinence-based program. Those are hard things to, they conflict in some ways.
Is that conflict though managed with the knowledge that each person has a different path?
Yes. So I don't believe in abstinence works for everyone. I think the problem with the fentanyl crisis is, unless you choose to work in harm reduction track, you're not going to live forever, right? There was heroin addicts that could live a really, really long time. Yeah. Fentanyl is a different ball game, and that's not the case. It's seeming to be.
And I want to make sure I got this right. Are you still saying that harm reduction is the process even with fentanyl, or are you saying fentanyl is really challenging the harm reduction model?
No, I think harm reduction is definitely still a thing with fentanyl. I just don't think, you can be necessarily an old fentanyl addict anymore. You're not going to live doing fentanyl for years and years and years like you could different, opiates. Fentanyl has changed the drug world completely. And
has that changed how harm reduction moves forward? Being that what worked with maybe heroin or other drugs was that there was time to allow the needs to be met, and then the person to find that journey to recovery on their own, on their own terms. And I'm expecting the answer to be no, because I think the principles of harm reduction are still correct and true, but the cruel reality is that the time available for that to unfold might not be there for a lot of folks that are addicted to fentanyl.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that harm reduction has not changed. The methods of harm reduction have changed. So, for example, people are not using IV drug use as much as they used to. Fentanyl is smoked on foil, right? So people are trying to create foil, pipes for fentanyl, so people don't have to smoke it on foil. Harm reduction has grown to many things since then. Street outreach, wound care, bringing safe use supplies to people, safe consumption sites, those types of things are harm reduction. And so I think harm reduction is ever changing and needs to be. It needs to follow what the drug trends are.
Yeah, but always seeing the person, right? I mean,
I think that
focusing on the person as opposed to the addict.
Correct. I think, my biggest thing that I learned through facing homelessness and the nonprofits I chose to work for is you meet people where they're at. and you don't have expectations for them, and you like it's based on their goals and what they think is best for them, and you just have to meet people where they're at. And I think there's organizations that don't believe in that, right? They believe that like harm reduction is enabling and housing first, people need to get sober before they deserve housing and all these things. And those are just not principles I live by. I believe that you can't get sober if you live outside. You can. I think it's very difficult. You have to be a very, very, very strong person. I never addressed substance use disorder with my clients when I was working in homeless services because I didn't feel it was right.
Well, you also slip into, and I think you were beginning to talk about this early on, that when you're in service to others, you have to be very careful not to create a hierarchy. And if you begin to judge somebody's drug use, you right away step into the power play move, which is, I'm not addicted, you are, you need help, you're less, and I'm going to give you some advice about that. And there you go. You're off to the races.
Who was I to judge my clients with substance abuse disorder when I had substance abuse disorder myself,
yeah.
right?
Well, and that's another whole conversation, right? Because who doesn't have some sort of addiction? We live in a self-medicating society, and everyone has a drug of choice.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say everyone, but we're talking about food, cigarettes, porn. I mean, there is no shortage of things that people find themselves addicted to.
Yeah. So the program that the Buddhist recovery program that I work addresses process addictions as well. So it's not just for substance abuse disorder; it's for process addictions. And I think, process addictions are prevalent in people with substance abuse disorder. I definitely have process addictions.
Define process addictions for us.
Gambling, porn.
I see.
Like anything that creates dopamine, right? Overeating, undereating. So I think that, like everyone, I have a process addiction to my phone, right? Like people have process addictions social media, computers, like you can name hundreds of process addictions, right?
Yeah.
And so.
Well, dopamine, as you said, like makes us hunt for those. Okay, maybe that's another whole talk. I think people listening to this will say, wow, this suburban white girl who's got an education, is attractive, is like got the world on a string, and she's like found this amazing love with this person that was actually out on the street. Like one of the more important people in your life, clearly.
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
Yeah.
I guess my question.
I would definitely say my relationship with James and my friendship with him was my most life-changing friendship. Like, I get choked up thinking about it because the love we shared was just so, like, natural and real. And I think that anyone is capable of it, right? I think you have to meet the person where they're at. You have to see them as a human. You have to look past their flaws and their scariness, maybe sometimes, and really embrace who they are. I don't look at my friendship with James as different than any other friendship I have, except for the fact that it changed my life, right? Yeah. I deeply care about all of my friends the way I cared about James. They're just not unhoused, right? Like there's the difference, right? And I think you just have to embrace people as they are. I didn't connect with all my clients the way that I connected with James, but I connected with a few of them the way I connected with James, and they're people that I truly love. Yeah. And I think you just have to let down, like you got to get rid of those stigmas, and you got to just look at people for who they are,
The episode that we just released on Reverend Rick Reynolds, he said something that I think speaks into what you're talking about, and he asked, are you willing, right? That I'm not even asking you to do anything. Are you just willing to do something? Are you willing to be open? And I think that's a profound call, right? Like, because we're all pretty guarded when it comes to being open to a friendship with someone that's homeless, right? That's a little out of bounds. And then let alone actually really love this person. That's a tall order.
Yeah, and I think, I'm blessed in the fact that I met a lot of my unhoused friends going into homeless services through you, and I got to see how you had friendships with people that lived outside. And I think everyone is capable of that, but you have to be open to it, like you said. You have to be willing. You know, there's plenty of ways to do it too, right?
Yeah, and I think the beautiful thing, I've thought about this a lot, about actually the interaction with the homeless community, and that the simple question, are you willing, to ask yourself that, are you willing? And if your answer is no, then that's an entry into another conversation, which is, why not?
Yep.
Like, what do I have going on in my life that is keeping me from being willing to have a friendship with someone that's suffering outside without basic needs being met? Like, okay, something's going on inside of me, because that's, I think, contrary to our human nature, which is if someone is struggling, to reach out to them and be in service to them, to see ourselves in them, and to know that, this, a deeper sense of what empathy in action looks like.
Yeah. And I think that you can come from any background, any political belief, any religious belief, and you can be willing. You can be willing without believing in harm reduction. Do I believe everyone should believe in harm reduction? Hell yeah. But, not everyone's going to believe in those principles. And so I think
lots of paths to the top of
there's lots of paths, exactly. And I think finding your outlet, whether that's just like being more compassionate to the person panhandling at your exit, just like rolling down your window and saying hi, which is like, was the Just Say Hello campaign, like just recognizing that person as a person, to, building a friendship with the guy that lives in a tent down the street and going and asking like, hey, my name's blah, blah, blah. What's your name? Like, is there anything I can do to help you? Yeah. But I think the barrier to people that are housed helping the unhoused is what has created the unhoused, right? Like it's not the unhoused people's problem to solve. It is the housed people's problem.
I would agree with that 100%.
To solve, right? And to put it on like churches and homeless services, like this problem's not going to be solved without more substance abuse disorder treatment, more mental health treatment, better services meeting people's basic needs. I'm a firm believer in like, if people's basic needs are not being met, what can you really expect of them?
Yeah. If then we are part of the problem, then therefore we have to be part of the solution, right? Like, it's incumbent on us. Like, if we know that we're actually part of why this is all unfolding, then we have to take the steps to erase that.
Yeah.
But if we're in the way of that, because of our negative stereotype views or the way that we're conducting our life in any way that brings a barrier to those that are outside, we have to look at that and say, is that what we want to do? Is that who we want to be?
Yeah. And it's actually been studied that housing people is far cheaper than what we're doing right now. Yeah. So if you don't believe in housing first, then I would suggest looking into some studies that prove providing housing to someone and keeping them housed is actually far, far cheaper than the methods that we are using right now.
If the doing the right thing isn't actually working for you, economically, if that's your focus, then that's also the path to go.
Yeah.
Is to give people housing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's really sad that there's this really big push right now in Seattle against harm reduction and against housing first by certain individuals, because it's been proven so many times. Like, we don't need to study homelessness anymore. We've studied it enough. We know what solves homelessness. It's housing first, harm reduction, meeting people where they're at. Like, it's all proven, right?
Health.
Mental health treatment. And in case you're wondering, mental health treatment in Washington State is extremely hard to receive, and our mental health hospitals are full. Like, if you think someone just needs to go to a mental health hospital, well,
find them a bed.
Like, and I think that's also the disconnect from the housed community to the unhoused communities. Are like, well, they just need to go to treatment. They just need to go to a mental health hospital. Do you know how long it takes to get a treatment bed if you're homeless? Because it's on average at least a month. So when someone wants to go to detox and wants to go to treatment, if it's going to take them another month to get there, for one, they might not be alive in a month. Two, they might not be wanting to make those same decisions, right? And so I just don't think we have so many talking points by certain people that are against the principles that are actually helping people, that my hope would be that people are more open to understanding why housing first is such a big principle and why harm reduction is such a big principle, because people that do the work understand that that's actually what helps.
Yeah, well, it always happens. The closer you get, the more you understand, and the more informed you are. And I would even say, you would probably agree, even from when you first started helping Peter and James versus what you know now, right? Just because you got closer, that's so.
My life principles are very, very, very different than they were 4 years ago. That's for sure.
What's next for you?
I'm not totally sure. So I left homeless services a little over a year ago to get sober. And I didn't get sober because I wanted to quit using. I got sober because I wanted to eventually start a family. And I knew I didn't want to be a pothead mom. Sometimes, it takes you getting sober for someone else. I nanny part-time right now. I just got a second job working part-time as an office manager for a criminal defense attorney. So I'm going to learn a little bit about social justice world in a different realm. But I think, my goals my goals are to continue to work in social justice and working with our unhoused neighbors. But I think, starting a family first is my main goal right now.
Often, when we see someone reaching out to be of service to someone in need, we can think that that's all that is happening, that a need is being met. And to be sure, that is happening, and it is important and beautiful. But what is often missed is that in those moments, both people are benefiting. Blair helped James get into housing and have basic needs met. She helped reconnect him with family, and maybe, most of all, feel loved in the last few years of his life. And James, what he did for Blair was to change her life. He helped her take an off-ramp from the path she was on, and in the process, she found her voice and her purpose in life. In talking with Blair, you can hear it in her voice. She wants all of us to take our own off-ramp, to learn that when you come closer to someone struggling, you will find that homelessness is unacceptable in our society.
We as a society have created that homelessness is acceptable. And then there's certain people in our society that don't believe that. And I think if we as a whole society didn't believe that people living outside is acceptable, homelessness wouldn't be acceptable.
I got a long way to go. When will I stop? Nobody knows. Like the wind only knows how to blow. I got a long way to go.
You Know Me Now is produced, written, and edited by Tomas Bernatsky and me, Rex Holbein. We would like to thank Blair for taking the time to speak with us. You Know Me Now has a Facebook and Instagram page where you can join in on the conversation. We also have a website at youknowmenow.com where you can see photos of Peter, James, and Blair. We also have stories of other folks we feel you should get to know. Thanks as always for listening.